I'm Naveen Koshi, and joining me here is Virat More and Mr. Mark Brandon. And welcome to Mind Matter podcast. Mark Brandon has immense experience in teaching various topics in history and is doing his dissertation at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich on the construction of a 20th century America. Welcome to Mind Matter podcast, Mr. Brandon.
Thank you.
So let's start with this. If you could go back in, so you know our topic today, it's about how there are different perspectives to history and how these different perspectives are viewed in different stratas of society and how that's being controlled, basically. So if you could go back in time and experience one historical event for yourself, just to see for yourself what is the real truth, where would it be and when would it be and why?
Okay, so a lot of people ask me this question because I'm a historian and I always have a hard time answering, but I have thought it over because so many people have asked me. And I have to say, and there might be a little lesson in it too, I have to say, oftentimes I don't think it's quite the event that's so important. It's the people and the things around it. Sometimes events happen and people don't quite realize their significance. Right. So I'm going to tell you my event, and it's 1517, and Martin Luther, the 95 Theses in Wittenberg, when he takes the 95 Theses and he nails it to the door. And there's a little prehistory to that and a little post-history to that, because when he did it, I don't think he quite understood the entire significance of what he was doing. Mm-hmm. And it's the personality around that event to Martin Luther, the reformer, that fascinates me. And this is a person that he's one of these people that's so incredibly just honest, takes everything so seriously and so literally, to use that word. And so he takes the system of the Roman Catholic Church so seriously, in the sense that the official theology is, I'm a sinner and I'm going to hell. And I need to pay for this somehow. I need to confess my sins. I need to make atonement for my sins. And he takes that so seriously, probably more seriously than anybody else. He's confessing his sins and he's thinking, well, I'm constantly confessing my sins. Isn't that because I'm obsessed with myself? Isn't that pride? Because I'm so fearful of going to hell. Isn't that a sin? Mm-hmm. And he thinks like this. So he gets it. He works himself to this point where it almost drives him crazy, and he starts studying the Bible, and he finds the Bible, this passage in the epistles of Paul, salvation is by faith alone. And it's such a great relief for him. And he starts telling us, he's a university professor, and he starts telling his students this. And it's very, very powerful because it answers this deep question that they all have. He's struggled with it the most intensely, I think, because he's this kind of person that he can't just leave it alone. He's got to settle this, and he takes it so honestly. And so he answers this question. I think it's great relief for him. And so then the monk comes through Saxony and he's selling indulgences, right? And indulgences are very, very complicated, but the basic idea, as most people know it, is it's something like you pay for your sins. You pay money, literally, you put it in a box, pay for your sins. And Luther looks at this and thinks, well, that's possible. I just figured out from the study of the Bible that you can't pay for your sins. And so in protest to that, the selling of indulgences, he writes 95 theses in Latin. Probably nobody can understand them. And he nails them to the church door. And these are 95 theses why indulgences are a bad thing. So that's kind of the post-history. As I said, I don't think he really quite understood the significance of all of that. It was just meaningful to him because it's this question that he'd struggled with for so long, and he kind of came to a solution. He could clearly see, well, indulgences, it doesn't work. It's impossible, and here's the reasons why. So I think it takes some time, but of course the Roman Catholic Church had a lot of really smart people, and I think theologians, lawyers, people like that, and I think they saw the implications. And so here's sort of the post-history. I told you the prehistory, here's kind of the post-history, and this is how a seemingly insignificant event can sort of rock the world. It becomes clear to some people that what he's saying is incredibly powerful. Not only does it solve a kind of spiritual problem for people, but there's more, because that edifice that the Roman Catholic Church built on this idea of paying for sins, well, they had set up this system of sacraments, and the only people that could administer were priests, and priests had to be consecrated by a bishop. And
I believe there are several levels of sacrament as well, and that only certain sacraments could be given by a certain rank of priest and so on. And
well,
so
you have to be officially a priest, consecrated by a bishop, to create sacraments. And I think the point is that there's this official way to pay for your salvation. You start out sinful, and then you get grace through the church by paying for the sacraments, and the priests administer that. And only a priest can do it, and it's kind of a monopoly, but there's more. But by the way, and I should say, what Luther is saying is you don't need any of that, and you don't need the priest. And it takes him a couple of years to figure it out, but then he writes this book, Priesthood of Believers, all believers, and the idea is each believer by faith can go directly to God, and you don't have to go through the sacraments, which eliminates that specialized priest. But here's the other thing I was going to say. There's a lot of other things attached to that. It's the feudal ages. So usually some land allotments go with that. So you see there's priests, but they control the sacraments, but they also have property interests, they have economic interests, they have material interests, they have prestige. And so this idea that Luther comes up with, and that's the point I'm making, in October 1517, when he posts that to the church door, I'm not sure he fully understands the implications. I'm not sure anybody else does, but it's this idea of salvation by faith alone, that has huge implications, and it's not just about abstract ideas about salvation. It is that, but it's an idea, and it contains so much more. It has, and there's an economic critique implicit. There's a social critique, and that's why the Roman Catholic Church, it takes a little while, but they realize this is dangerous.
it's a very individualistic view of faith, actually.
Historians debate that.
Okay.
You could take it that way. You could certainly take it that way. I'm not trying to say that's a wrong interpretation. In reality, how individualistic do Lutheran churches end up being is a question that a lot of historians ask. But I think more for me, you asked me an event, and I'm telling you, here's an event in which an idea is expressed, and probably when it happened, not too many people quite understood the significance of that idea.
Right.
But over time, it was a really explosive idea, a really powerful idea.
Right.
And for me also, as a man of ideas, it's really important to me in the sense that certain ideas, especially when they're criticized, they contain so much more. People have careers, economic interests attached to ideas, and when somebody is able to sort of break through that and challenge it, the special position of the priesthood, it's more than just a few obscure religious ideas that are hard for modern people to understand. It's an entire network of social and economic obligations. And so that one event sort of unleashes these huge changes. So you asked me my event, and you got a long story.
And so let's go into the various today's main topic is how historical narratives are different in different societies, and how these sort of clash with each other. These different narratives clash with each other. And some of the important sources of our history are the primary sources, which are attached to art, literature, personal records of people. What do you think? How does all of this become different for different societies? How does art represent something for one society and something else for another society at the same time?
Well, okay. I have to think a little bit about how I want to answer that.
That's fine. We can actually try it out.
It's partly about. It's a question of historical interpretation, and it kind of goes to what historians do. So, where do I want to start with this? Very few people really look at primary sources. And the historian's job is to look at those, and they're very difficult. They're in archives. they're not on the internet. Oftentimes they're in obscure languages, and there's a lot of them, and you have to sort through them. They're hard to understand. They're written often in idioms that, even if it's 50 or 100 years ago, it's still different.
It can be a slogan at the bottom of a statue. I mean, it's things of that sort.
I can give a long lecture on primary sources, and there's all different kinds of them, but very few people actually see them, and that's the historian's job, is to take those sources. And most historians, I mean, you mentioned art history, that's fine. Most historians end up really looking at written sources. And it's not the only way to examine history, but it tends to be the most predominant. And most historians I know work with sources.
And why do you think that is, actually, if you don't mind asking?
Well, I can tell you and I want to get back to try to answer your question at some point, but that's fine. Maybe I'll just tell you my personal view on that. And there's some professional bias here, but I feel much more confident with written sources. And it's weird too. It's a bit of a paradox, because like archaeology, for example, a lot of people think that it's somehow more objective than history. But in fact, if you think about it, if you look at a cup, something, if it doesn't say anything, there could be all kinds of interpretations.
It says a lot. I mean, how was the cup made?
Certainly.
What are the materials? Are they local materials?
Certainly, and you're speaking like an archaeologist, and I don't want to criticize their profession, but my impression when I read a textbook, and history books often will have a little bit of archaeology, and they'll say, well, this cup meant something about the afterlife. And as a historian, I always think, well, how do you know that? Show me a written source. Now, if I see the person that designed, or a picture as well, art, a painting, if I see a description by the artist explaining me what that's about, I feel much more comfortable than if I just am trying to interpret it based on what I see now. And I told you there's some pride in my profession there, and I'm not trying to denigrate other people's disciplines, but I'm just telling you, look, if I have written sources, I feel much better. Now, there are a lot of problems with written sources, as I just described to you. There's a lot of problems. And so to get back to your question, and feel free to interrupt me at any time, but to get back to the question, so the historian's job is to take those sources, whatever he or she can find, and not all of them are there, many of them are missing, or the ones that I choose as a historian, and to put those together and make a story. And I always say that historians basically are writing a story. It's different from the kind of story if I just go down in my basement and write a novel. The historians have different rules, and the rules are we have to play with only the sources that we have. We have to use those and put those together, but there's always some choice. Actually, there's a lot of choice that the historian makes in how to assemble those sources. And so I'm finally maybe getting around to your question. Different historians, and you said different cultures, but even within one culture, and there's of course the big question of what is culture anyway, but they have different priorities, right? And so that takes them to different sources in the first place. There's an infinite number of sources in some cases. And so it takes them to different sources, and then it also shapes the way they interpret those sources. And that's why, and if I understand your question correctly, similar types of sources, or sometimes even the same sources, can come out radically different in a history book. And two historians can have really radically different interpretations. And that's because each one is doing his best to tell a story based on those sources, but it comes out differently. There's a lot of the historian's judgment that goes into that, and so it comes out differently for each one. I hope somehow maybe...
It's true, we see that a lot when comparing the analyses of ancient historians and more modern historians, for example, the perspectives are completely different.
Absolutely, absolutely. What do you do with things like the miraculous in the past? Most people, since about the Enlightenment, most I don't want to say professional historians because they haven't been around that long, but most serious historians, let's say, don't accept supernatural events. Before that, probably most did, Speaking about the Protestant Reformation, most of them were Protestants or Catholics, and when they read about miracles, they used it to defend their version of Christianity. But after about the Enlightenment, nobody accepts that. So, yeah, a book written before the Enlightenment, a book written before the Industrial Revolution, a book written 100 years ago, they are going to be radically different. And the interpretation of certain events, the Civil War in the United States, World War I, and World War II, and they're always changing. That interpretation is always changing as we get farther and farther away from those
Still
events.
less ambiguous than art.
Yes, you've got me, because I did say there are problems with written sources, and there's
No, but I mean this honestly. Like art can be very ambiguous because every piece of art needs a key in order to interpret it. While a text, the key is contained within the text.
it can be hard to find, and again, I don't want to disparage art historians. I have some friends that are good art historians, and I preface that by saying that's my personal feeling. I'm very biased toward the written word. I like to read things, and so that's a little bit my own personality, but after all of that, I kind of still agree with you. There's more ambiguity to me in the...
No, but I have a good example actually of a bad interpretation because of just looking a bit too quickly at the art. There was a mural painting inside of a temple in Egypt, and 40 years ago when they made the proper excavations, the assumption was that one of the objects held in the hand was a ceremonial vase. 3 decades later, they reevaluated. It was probably a water container. It was used to wet the sand in order to help them carry stones. So it completely changes everything. It's not a ceremony. This is actually a construction site that's been depicted.
Yeah, that's a great example. Sure. Yeah.
But there's a problem with written history, no? I think
there's a lot of problems with written history.
There's only about 5,000 years of written history or so, isn't it?
Yes.
Like before that,
about 3,500 BC is the first writing.
Because before that, I mean, how do you sort of try to determine how things happened before and what are the things happened before? And you have to rely on archaeological evidence and art in general. And another thing that I wanted to bring up is linguistics. The study of linguistics actually tries to solve the problem of how people migrated in different ways. Do you think it's relevant, the contribution of linguistics is relevant to how we determine history?
In some way.
Right.
In some way. Of course, the classic problem is with the Indo-European languages, and how did they get to all the places where they managed to get, right? You know what I'm talking about. How did they get to Persia? How did the various Indian languages get there? And so that's kind of, although I think I'm not at all an expert in linguistics, but I know that has been interpreted various ways, and it's not really clear where's the origination point. And there were people, I can tell you of Madison Grant, 1916, passing of the Great Race, who would say, look, like the Aryan languages, as he would call them, got to India because white people from Europe conquered it thousands of years ago, and then they left. I don't know. I think that's pretty fanciful, to be honest. And I only...
What are white people?
Well, and
are Persians white people?
Well, yes, of course. And that's the other thing, too. Even if you identify that Indo-European homeland, we have no idea what those people looked like. We have no idea what they looked like. So, but I only use that as an example. I'm not making specific points about that, only to say that the problem with linguistics is an example, let's say, of the problem with trying to trace history through linguistics. There's various different ways you can do that, and there's competing interpretations.
Right. And that will never be more definitive. Like, you can't definitively say that this is what happened from linguistics, right?
It doesn't account for cultural osmosis as well.
Yes.
So if somebody adopts another person's culture, in the linguistic map, what you've seen is, people's been genocided, but actually they've simply been integrated.
Well, and yeah, loan words, for example. I know with the Indo-European languages, supposedly some people have tried to reconstruct that, and this is outside my area of expertise.
It's very theoretical.
And so they've tried to reduce that to a set of a few words that all the Indo-European languages have in common. And perhaps the idea is, this is what Max Muller, I think the German linguist who lived in England most of his life, but I think this is what he's trying to do. And he thinks that he can, by reducing it to that set of words that all Indo-European languages share, that you can identify the homeland. I don't know, maybe not. I think that's pretty theoretical stuff.
But before they got to the homeland, where did these people come from?
Yeah, yeah.
How far back do you go? I mean,
yeah, I think there's all kinds of.
If you go back far enough, where we used to be fishing the sea, you know, is that home?
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of problems. You can. They might share common words, but how do you know they didn't borrow them later? It could be a question. But I'm not a linguist, so you'd rather have a linguist come probably and say more about that. But I only know a little bit about.
But it's true. It does grab you because there are some similarities which are extremely striking. Like,
yeah.
I mean, like counting from 1 to 5 in Czech and in Hindi.
Yes.
Actually, it sounds quite alike.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not just or a lot of the sounds are the same. For example, a lot of pronunciations will exist.
The word for mother, the word for fire. There's a lot of common.
So I can understand why it might grab the imagination of some people.
Well, sure. And the people that first did this are a lot of the British East India people. What's his name? William Jones, I believe, is the guy who first in the late 1700s presented the paper. And there's a lot of those British East India bureaucrats were gentlemen scholars, and they all knew Greek and Latin and several other languages, and they generally learned Persian and Hindi, and they were interested in Indian languages and ultimately Sanskrit. And so they're the ones that first recognized that.
The commonalities.
Commonalities, yeah. And they're striking. It's fascinating. Just what can you make of it historically? I'm not totally sure. It's interesting to try.
Right, so we were talking about how different cultures can have different perspectives about the same event or the same, historical, what happened in history, basically. So two cultures can have different narratives within their cultural narratives of what happened in one event.
Yeah,
an example?
I don't know, the British rule in India is a good example of how, the divide and rule. I think the British perspective is that India sort of disintegrated into Pakistan and India by itself. And what's taught in Indian history is that it was a method used by Britain to divisively separate the Muslims and the Hindus and enforce their power on top of that. I think that's one of the examples.
Why would you do that when you're leaving? I mean, it's sort of like leaving a bomb behind you as you walk out.
No, it's not that they only did that while they were leaving. Also, think about this: the area of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh together. Don't you think it would have been a massive country?
Yes, it would have.
Yeah, so they had that.
It would have been their ally against China.
I guess, yeah.
Well, I mean, there is the Partition of Bengal, 1907, and the British. There's an example, but as it was happening, the British claimed that it was for administrative reasons. A lot of people in the Indian National Congress I know claimed that was to incite Muslims, and it's pretty clear that the British. Well, I want to be careful about that. I mean, a lot of people feel that the British kind of sponsored the Muslim minority against the Hindu majority. And so all I'm saying, not which side is true, but I think that adds to what you're saying about, well, here's a way in which two different cultures, although I don't even think you have to say cultures, two different individuals can differ radically in their interpretation of history. But that's a good example where maybe some more nationalist inclined Indian scholars and some more, let's say, British Empire supporters might have very differing interpretations of what happened in India after 1947, that is.
Yeah.
What you said actually makes a lot of sense, the idea that the British would be sponsoring the Muslim minority, because the Muslim minority had been the ruling class
Sure.
before even the
Delhi
British
Sultan and all of that. Yeah, sure.
They were the sultans, they were the rajas, they were the bureaucrats, they were the enforcers of the law. So it would make sense for them to just keep the same institutions and just change the head.
It's easy to see why somebody would come to that conclusion. Sure. Yeah, I'm not trying to accuse the British of anything, but I think that's a great example.
The British, but they're all dead, so.
Well, I think that's a great example of the kind of battle that goes on over history. Is for a lot of reasons, people, and it comes down to cultures. That's a little vague, but it can be different individuals. It can be political causes. People a lot of times feel that they need history to say a certain thing. And that's why states, and this gets very complicated, but I think that's why states often get involved in one way or another. What do you put in the textbooks?
Right. Because history is a very important thing for the status quo narrative, I think.
Yeah.
It's a defining factor for how a nationalist sentiment.
Well, you have to justify why does the state exist?
Yeah, exactly. And my question actually was that everybody sort of accepts the fact that history is written by the victors of wars. Do you agree with that statement?
Generally, yes. There's usually a revision in history after some point. Mm-hmm. It takes some time, but again, it's a little vague, but generally, so I said the story of the historian is to use the sources to tell a story. The job of the historian is to use the sources to tell a story. So who has the means and the ability to do that? Well, it has to be a society that has a certain level of wealth that can support scholars. It has to be people that have somehow attained a position in life where they have time to develop the skills to do that and access to the resources. And so people have to kind of get to a position of power, and then they have access to the sources and they develop the skills, and then they're able to write the history. And well, who usually is in those positions first? Well, in some way, the winners. Mm-hmm. And it might be a military victory, it might be another kind of winning, but somehow it has to be somebody who has the ability and the access to do that. And so those are the people that write history. Now, I think it's fortunate that times always change and new people fight their way to the top. New people get in positions where they can do that. I think, look at the rise of women's history in the last 50 years now, and that makes perfect sense. As the situation for women has changed, they get into academics, they become professors, they have the time, the money, the resources, the skill, and of course they're going to write women's history that's important to them. And it is kind of the winners that write history, but that changes. Like who's the winner changes over time, and I think that's a good thing.
And don't you think it also depends on how, in a sense, what kind of win it was? If it was just because of sheer quantity of their forces, if they were not as technologically developed as the forces that got defeated, don't you think the technology will be absorbed into them? So technologically, the victors will actually absorb what the culture of the defeated was. Do you see what I'm talking about?
Yes, I kind of see it the reverse, though.
Oh, right.
But if you have an example, you can, because I'm thinking Romans and Greeks maybe, but it's not as simple as that. It's very much you have very much a synthesis of both cultures that happens.
I can't get an example from the top of my head.
Well, I think colonialism is a great example. I mean, certainly there's a lot more history written about independent post-colonial countries today, like India or African states, than there was in the 1930s. And not only that, but it's written definitely from a different perspective. And I would ask you, which languages is it probably written in?
English.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I would also venture to say, and I know this might be kind of controversial, but I would also venture to say generally using the tools of scholarship that came from the empires, to be honest. So this is the thing where, you know, the people that are, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but we'll get to it, but the people that conquered, and the people that are conquered, let's say, are smart human beings, and they quickly learn the skills that they need. And so that's what I'm saying about, well, they rise eventually to the point where they're in a position now to write history a different way, from a different perspective. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes,
Okay. Sorry.
No, about the statement you made earlier about sort of history being written by the victors. I mean, if even though the victors change, because you know nobody can stay on top forever, doesn't that just mean that history is at the whims of history? History will just swing all over the place depending on.
To some extent, yes. I do think this is where having a free and open discussion is really very, very important. This is where we kind of can check each other. And I think that's that, because we do, you can't just say anything you want without being challenged. I mean, you can if you have an authoritarian state and you're the designated spokesman for that state, and then you can write history however you want, and anybody that challenges you gets in trouble. But if you have an open classroom like we have, or open public where you can publish a book and anybody can criticize it, then you can't just say whatever you want and expect no response. Somebody's going to respond. So yeah, history interpretations sway back and forth, absolutely, but it doesn't mean that there's no improvement over time, because people check each other. And even that desire to tell the story differently, and I have that a lot. I know that feeling. That's a good thing, because what that makes you do is, well, that makes you sort of check and correct what the other people said, and so you want to tell the way you think it should be told. But you know, I always say you have to have a certain kind of humility in history, because you want to disassemble somebody else's interpretation, but you always have to realize that sooner or later some young person is going to come along and attack your interpretation. And it's going to happen. It has to happen. And hopefully out of that, somebody can look back and see and sort of compare all of those and take the best out of all of them. And slowly certain ideas are discarded over time.
No, it's just I'm more of a fan of the quiet survivor. These type of people who simply kept their head down long enough that they kept it on their shoulders, and they were able to write about the events from a very close perspective.
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes we get sources of people that we don't expect. I mean, I don't know exactly what to say about that, but I think the question is, and the conversation has been kind of going this way, who determines the historical narrative, I think. So you get these interesting sources of people who are kind of, non-participants, but the question is 100 years later, which historians get to interpret that and how?
And do the works even survive that long?
Well, that's, this is the thing about humility, because there are so many sources that don't survive. And of course, the other thing to remember too is nobody is a neutral observer of anything. And there's an infinite number of facts. And that means you have to, I don't like the word facts much. Let's say there's an infinite amount of data. And so you have to select what data is important to you. So even if you keep a journal and you try to record everything that happens to you, well, a lot of things happen to you that you won't record. You just record the things that are important to you. And everybody's like that. So there's no such thing as an objective record of events. It doesn't exist. Some people are more dispassionate than others. But that can be tricky too, because somebody writing 100 years ago, you don't know for sure how attached they are to a certain. Anyway, I don't mean to wander too much, but.
So we were saying about how people can be passionate or dispassionate about what narrative they want to keep and what they want to actually. Don't you think in today's world, people are selectively choosing certain events from history and trying to create their own narrative? An example that I'm trying to say is, for example, the Pan-African movement, if this makes any kind of sense. They've tried to.
I'm afraid it does. Now I'm going to have to deal with it. Okay, go ahead.
The Pan-Africanism movement, for example, they've tried to take like different narratives from different parts and like stitch it together and say that there was always the concept of a united Africa, and I don't think it's actually necessarily true, because Africa is one of the most diverse continents on the planet. And yeah, so what do you think about this? Because people selectively just taking events from history and stitching it together and saying, yeah, this is the narrative that we want to run right now,
Yes, they do. Absolutely, and that is a really interesting case. Sekou Touré, Kwame Nkrumah, all of those folks, that they were African nationalist leaders in the 1960s. Definitely, Ghana is further north than the one that's there now. The Old Kingdom was further north, and there's been. Historians are aware of this, that there's this kind of constructed national history, and it's kind of modern myth-making.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. The only thing I would say is a lot of the research about that is based on similar research about Europe, about European national identities.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of historians, Eric Hobsbawm was one of the famous ones, who died a couple years ago. I'm sorry, my memory is failing me now. Imagined Communities. Benedict Anderson is another one. And they would say that, in fact, the European national identities, a similar thing happened, in the sense that they were constructed sometime in the 19th century, different ones at different times, and there's a certain kind of artificiality about that.
Right.
It doesn't really match what the world was like before that.
Right.
And so all I'm saying there is people are, I think, a little bit unduly harsh with African identities, if you see what I'm saying, for various reasons. But they don't realize that probably European national identities went through a similar process just earlier. Mm-hmm. And they're all, in a sense, kind of like artificial. And in some way, so what? Like, this is the point. People are always competing about the historical narrative and how they want to tell the story. And it's the job of the historian to constantly try to be filtering that out, or filtering it to get what we hope is the most, I don't like to say accurate, credible story, is what I like to say.
Well, I just think the only sort of the main contention I have is that there is no African nation, so you can't build an African nationalism. That's really my only main contention. I mean, you cannot have a unified Africa because there is no African nation. There are many African nations which can have their own national mythologies.
Well,
but a single African nation would, it's the only thing I can think of which is more silly than a united Europe. I mean, it's too different.
Except that the whole nationality question it's flexible. Like, you can build a nation in several different ways. And
I agree.
There's several national identities that have failed.
It's only the narrative which matters, I think. The person who's, or the group of people who are behind building the nationalist narrative, what they say and how credible that is and how credible that sounds to the people. I think that's all that matters in terms of that.
But the root of nationalism is sort of like in people's tribal identities, and it sort of outgrows out of that.
Well, it's not.
No?
Probably no. It's more like in the Industrial Revolution. Maybe. I mean, that's.
No, I mean, it's a more sophisticated form of it.
It's.
If you disagree, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really complicated question. Where do national identities come from? The French Revolution might have something to do with it. The rise of the printing press, because it standardizes certain languages and not others, by the way. Some of them kind of disappear. The state plays some role in creating it. That's a complicated question.
Probably one of the biggest, since
it might.
They spread the.
Like I said, Eric Hobsbawm, Benedict Anderson are probably the two main ones that you want to check out on this topic. It's a complicated discussion, but certain nationalities fail. Czechoslovakian national identity didn't work out. Yugoslavian national identity, Bavarian national identity. So it's possible. There's different ways to form these kind of identities, and they're always flexible. You know, are you British, English, Welsh, Arab, Egyptian, Muslim? Like these kind of identities can always be rebuilt in a different way, and it's not all about history either. There's a lot of things going on, but you know, how people tell their story of history reflects what they want to build as a national identity.
And so we were talking about the Catholic Church earlier. This has been
fun.
this has been one of the most controlling organizations in these 2000 after 0 AD, which is
the church doesn't arrive straight away.
Sure, of course. But
and when it arrives is kind of controversial too. But
yeah. And don't you think organizations like the Catholic Church have still a massive influence of how historical narratives are presented to people? And books like the Bible are taken as credible sources for a lot of people to interpret history and to, you know, say definitively that this is what happened and to think that.
yes and no. You know, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe was very influential. There's no question about that. I wouldn't say it was one of the most controlling institutions of all time. I would say the modern state has far more capability to control people than the Roman Catholic Church.
Just look at tax percentages. I mean, the church tax was the highest tax in most cases, and we're talking maybe 10%. It's a completely different level of control. But this is because of today we have modern systems of communication. It's not that they didn't try.
Yeah, I would say even the simple ability to tax consistently and efficiently, I don't think there's any. You're talking about a world before the French Revolution, before the rise of the modern state, when any political organization, its abilities to do that, I think, were pretty limited.
Because they relied on the local authorities usually.
Yeah, they have to call your parliament, and there were hundreds of them, and various other sort of noble organizations throughout Europe, and ask them to levy taxes, and they always demand things in return. And so, yeah, you see constantly fighting about who's going to pay the taxes, the king versus the parliament or the estates or whatever organization it has to be. Modern states have an incredible ability to compel people to pay taxes and obey laws and register and file their place of residence and take a census. They have just an incredible ability to do those things, and I don't think most people appreciate how much power there is in a modern state. The church kind of haphazard compared to that. They're powerful, there's no question. Partly, I think, because there's not much else. There's no real ideological alternative to the church. And so they're powerful in that sense. They're landowners. They control property. They have places where they can put their paintings up and their statues and build buildings and all of that. And so they definitely control education. Yeah. So definitely they have lots of points where they can influence people, but I think not nearly like the modern state.
And yeah, you were talking about how in modern times this has changed, and the modern state basically. And I think what's changed with the digital age is that it's just the amount of data. So you mentioned the census, just the amount of data which can be collected to interpret history. I think this has shifted the scales of how history is written, you know?
Yeah.
From a scarcity, it's gone to abundance and to like beyond abundance. So how it's become much harder to ascertain what was right because of polarization on different sides of.
I think it's always been equally hard to ascertain what's right.
But don't you think it's getting harder though?
I think it's getting easier because at least the information's there, as long as you have the patience to sift through it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you have enough interns, sitting there and reading through it, then maybe you can do it. But with the problem with older sources is that it's just so much of it has been destroyed and lost. And some works we know are missing. We're hoping we might find them someday. Some works we didn't even know existed until recent discovery. Some we will never know about.
I think I like the way this discussion is going because it keeps coming back to the role of the historian as interpreter, and I think that's really important. And I always say it this way, well, there was earlier periods of history, the problem, like the ancient periods, is there's not enough. And we're always guessing what kind of sources might have existed.
Sometimes we have a single source for 200 or 300 year periods.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then, so then there's the printing press, and the printing press is kind of like the first information revolution. They very quickly, it takes like 50 years, and they're spitting out cheap books everywhere. And they've got them all over Europe, and as soon as they discover the Americas, they take them there, and they're in Istanbul. And
romantic novels.
well, that comes a little later, but I'm talking like Martin Luther. I started with that, and he took advantage of the latest technology, the printing press. It was still relatively new, and so there was tons of information. So what I'm getting at is, to the earlier period, there's not enough information, and now we get into the printing press, and there's too much. And then with the machine age printing presses, they're even more efficient, and every single little club and village everywhere has its own newspaper. And now, of course, we're in the digital age, and to me, that's just an extension of that. But if you want to go back even 100 years, there's already far more historical material than anybody will ever be able to read. So here's the problem. And I know this personally. When you go to the archive, if you study the modern period, there's so much there you will never look at it all. There are documents in the World War II era, and there are documents that nobody will ever look at. And who knows what they say? They might have the most important information. So here's where the work of the historian comes in, and that storytelling, right? Is that you always go to the archive looking for something. You always go, you don't have your whole life to read everything in the archive. You would never finish. You always have a plan of what you want to look at, and that means you don't look at a lot of other things. So I know today they say confirmation bias, right? You're looking for something because you think it's true, and you're looking for evidence, and the human mind has a wonderful ability of always finding that evidence. You always find the evidence. And so I think this is the problem with the modern age, where, and now we have these, Google, right? Actually, you don't find things right away with Google. You have to know what you're looking for. You can type something in and you'll get tons and tons of stuff, and you can never read it all, and you wouldn't want to anyway, because half of it says the same thing over and over again, and a lot of it's not even believable. So you have to know what you're looking for, but there's the same thing again. You always have to know what you're looking for and what to look for. And that's something that you get from a liberal arts education. And you don't get that by Googling stuff. You have to know what to Google in the first place. But of course, the danger in that, like I said, is that, well, you find what you're looking for too, and you build up your little arguments to the point where they're invincible, and you think you're right about everything, and that's a problem as well.
But there's a huge reliance on Google today, which I find a little bit disturbing.
Yeah, I do too.
I remember I saw there was an invention done in India very recently by a young Indian student. He plugged himself into his computer, and he had two chips on his skull, and they would read his thoughts. So he would enunciate a question in his mind, the computer would read it, and would feed him the answer after a Google search into an earpiece. And so then the interviewer say, "Oh, so you could be an expert on anything." And I was completely outraged, like, no, he's an expert Googler.
Yeah.
He's the best Googler in the universe, but it makes him very good at finding the first result on Google.
Well, I had a discussion not too long ago. It was in a class somewhere, and we were talking about culture and what is culture. And so, of course, somebody in the back Googled it. And well, I happen to know the discussion about what is culture is at least 100 years old. It's a really, really complicated discussion just because you find a definition somewhere. If you have that kind of mind that, oh, that settles it because I found a definition on Google, well, you're missing a huge and complicated and fascinating and interesting debate. What is culture? It's not an easy question. It doesn't boil down to a one-sentence definition. It's much more complicated than that. And the way what people think it is, determines a lot about how the discussion goes. It's very, very important to understand, well, what do you think it is in the first place? So I don't want to go into that, just it's an example.
So
Google is making the prioritizing for you, so it's even more risky because it's not your bias, it's the AI's bias, and you don't know what that is.
Yeah, it's some kind of algorithm.
yeah,
that,
it's algorithm.
No, it is an algorithm. But the thing is that the algorithm depends also on your personal history, and depends on which computer you're searching it on, and it depends on Google's agenda. Well, no, I mean, it's not saying it in a sinister way. I mean, they have, they're, I guess they're pro-environment, so you would get pages, they'll be pro-environment first. You're not going to get flat Earth pages first. This sort of stuff, it doesn't have to be very sinister, but they have their own ideas about, what's right and what's wrong, and you will get that.
I have a mixed mind about it. Part of me is happy about it. I remember way back when I was in university getting a bachelor's degree in history, the professor gave us names of people to look up, and that was the assignment, to find out who they were, obscure people. And so you had to go to the library and go to the card catalog and get all these books out, and it took hours. And of course now you just type it in, and that's great. That's good, and I'm happy about that. That's a good thing, and I do that all the time when there's things I don't know. I Google them. But I am afraid that on first principle questions, serious questions, it creates an overconfidence.
Right.
What is culture? You can't, that's a discussion, it's not a definition.
Yeah.
It's a discussion, it has to be. What is democracy? I have people send me links. This is democracy. No, that's a really complicated discussion. You can't get away with that, and when you do, it's almost like you're being irresponsible.
With the tools that you're given, yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, if the definition changes depending on in which academic topic you're using it, then probably...
All of that is important to be aware of, absolutely. And over time. And
also.
What's the difference between the adjective democratic, and we don't have to discuss this, but and the noun democracy, and what about the Athenians who invented it in the first place, and how is it different from the Latin word res publica, republic? And those are all serious questions, and you can't just Google that and get a quick definition and be satisfied with yourself. And those are pressing questions because people say it all the time. Democratic Europe, democratic this, and they hold it up as kind of a religious value. And I'm not against it, but do you know what it is?
So it's an issue of using the right words.
And knowing what the words mean, and knowing what they mean, and that's when you start to seriously ask those questions, it takes you on a really long and complicated journey.
It's just the pitfalls of the ambiguity of language.
Yeah.
Well, I think we started in the context of talking about the false sense of security, and this idea, people say, another one, the word fanatic. People use that all the time as if it has some fixed meaning. Well, one man's fanatic is another man's freedom fighter. And that word doesn't have really a fixed definition. You can find a definition in the dictionary, but it doesn't tell you much. When you say religious fanatic, when you say Islamic fanatic, well, what does that mean? To different people, it means different things. And it's usually a negative term. That's how people usually use it, but not necessarily. If you're a fanatic football fan, it doesn't have to. So
even the word fan is derived from fanatic.
Yes, I think that's a good point, actually. Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of context to what these questions might pertain to, and how these definitions will make up what the answer to that question, in the sense that we were talking about.
Well, getting back to the Google thing is, it's a good tool to find out something. You don't know much about Albania. If I have an Albanian student, I don't know much about Albania, so I'll go home and Google it, find out, because it's better to know something, even if it's not right, than nothing. And I can work from there. I can improve my knowledge with time. But to use that, my feeling is that a lot of students, not just students, a lot of people use that, and they think that because it's technology, it gives them some sort of secret weapon. And that's what I'm saying, like, to really investigate principal basic questions, you can't just use Google. It's a irresponsible way of avoiding a very hard and arduous journey that you must take.
And we were talking about art earlier on, and how you mentioned, I think, sculptures and things like this. This might be a little.
I'm not very good at art, but okay, go ahead.
Isn't there a lot of expense which is associated with maintaining history or historical evidence as such?
Say that again.
Isn't there a lot of expense which is related with maintaining historical evidence? And also, the cultural narratives of a particular time can come against the maintenance of certain historical monuments, for example, statues and things like this.
Oh yeah.
Well,
You might have an example.
Well, I think the big one, I mean, that always comes up is, you know, should we paint the Greek temples?
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
it's because people are used to seeing them in all white, and they're used to, and then they see, you know, oh, it's actually bright pink with green and lots of yellow, and they kind of think this kind of looks kitsch, and let's just leave it white. I think that's fine. And so that's also, you know, our historical perspective coloring our vision of the past.
Colorizing films is another one. You know, I mean, of course, as a historian, I like the original sources to be left in their most pure, primitive. But
I have the same bias.
But the question is, what is that? And usually they're not. And the older they are, the farther removed they are from that original state. And the other thing is too, well, there used to be on Old Town Square here in Prague, there used to be a Marian column dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Well, they tore it down and they built the Hus statue instead. Why they, you know, purists would say, you know, put the Marian column back because that was originally there, but you know, they tore it down and they put them throughout Eastern Europe. They tore down statues of communist intellectuals and leaders after the Cold War because they didn't want to see them anymore. So
it was here, I think, in Letna Park.
And in Letna Park, there used to be a huge statue of Stalin.
I think all over Eastern Europe, yeah. In Latin, there was the one.
And colloquially, the park is still called Stalin.
Well, they renamed the streets too. So I don't know. As a historian, of course, I want to know how it was. On the other hand, this is the same sort of who tells the story of history and what's important to us and what do we want to say about ourselves. And I think there's a real tension between preserving things and recognizing that, well, that's no longer valid for us and we want to get rid of it.
The idea of restoration, I think, is actually a bit dangerous because a lot of the people who were changing the street names, they thought they were changing it back. It's like, oh, we had the communist period, you know, they came and they did all this stuff, now we're going to bring it back. And whatever they thought or their perception of what back is.
Yeah, that's...
And there's the temple in Knossos, again, another Hellenistic-ish temple, that was painted by an archaeologist, and it's been a huge scandal in the archaeological community because they don't know if those were the actual paintings. And the lead has actually damaged some of the murals since. So it's been a huge, and people just disagree with the patterns and so on. So how do you deal with that?
I know that with the Greek artwork back in the you're right, the 19th century, a lot of the archaeologists, the mural, parts are missing, we better finish it for them. So yeah, there's problems with that. I don't know where to.
By trying to be a good historian, you're actually destroying history.
Yeah, in some sense, yeah, it could be. And in a sense, we all probably, that's the humility thing. You know, I think I know that everything I've written, I try to be as absolutely true and honest to the text and the historical record as I can be. But I know that there's always parts where something is off or something isn't right. And that's where I would say, look, you always need to put that out in the public so that other people can look at it and review it and critique it and give you their opinion.
Yeah.
You're never going to get the historical record absolutely perfect. And when you do that, you probably distort it and maybe destroy it in some way.
Yeah. Also, don't you think this the cultural emphasis on how they should protect history and what parts of it they should protect, that also matters a lot, right?
Yeah, Well, come back to religion. I mean, everybody has, especially religious people, but ironically, even non-religious people, they all have this sense of what the pure religion should be. And as a historian, I'd say, well, change is important. And early Christianity, early Islam, first of all, there's a lot we don't know. And secondly, there's got to be a lot of change and variance of opinion in those early days. And people want to fix on a particular moment or a particular story, a particular thing, and say, that's emblematic of pure Christianity and everybody else is wrong. And like I said, ironically, non-religious people do that too.
Everybody's Christianity is pure Christianity.
In some sense, yeah.
or at least to them.
In some sense, yeah.
In early Christianity, what's interesting is there's a lot of purging, so we never know the other side of the story. With Islamic history, there is, because Arabic script is a lot younger than the religion, so we just don't have sources beyond a certain period, and it's just oral tradition that has been retranscribed.
Yes.
So there's always questioning of how accurate is the oral tradition. Same with Greek history. If you go back beyond the Homeric period and even in sort of the dark period and all this sort of stuff. So
these are the uncomfortable things that the historian knows. That basically we know how much we don't know. But to this idea of, well, what is important? Well, certain people fixate on certain things that, like early Christianity, it's pretty clear. What Jesus said, something like, if you want to follow me, sell all your goods and follow me, and give up all your material possessions.
Give no heed for the morrow?
Something like that.
Something about,
Sell all your possessions and follow me, come with me. And that's a big deal pretty clearly if you read the early Christian Eusebius and ecclesiastical history. The monks is what I'm getting at, like these people that really said, hey, I'm really going to sell all my property and be absolutely poor and live in a cave for Jesus. Like that was really important to early Christians. You don't see a lot of that today. So is that pure Christianity?
Right.
And I think the problem is everybody kind of has their own version of what pure Christianity or Islam is. There may be sort of a core story there. That's fine. But when you actually examine what we know about that period, there were a lot of people with a lot of different beliefs that called themselves Christians.
To this day, we have Nestorian Christians in China, which are completely unrelated to Catholic Christianity or Orthodox Christianity or any other.
The Persian church, certainly, some of which went to India too.
The Ethiopian church.
The Ethiopian church, absolutely.
Armenian church.
There's all sorts of very ancient groups, and they have their own version of what the purest version of Christianity is.
Yeah. And a lot of religions have an ascetic tradition also. So, I mean, the Islamic tradition has an ascetic tradition, the Hindu one, the Buddhist one. So maybe it's something about humans that makes them want to sell everything and own nothing, rather than the purest form of one specific religion or another.
Yeah, I would say, though, that's a good example of something that was very present in the early days of Christianity that a lot of people would say is pure Christianity. I'm not saying I buy that, but it's not really prevalent today in Christianity. You don't see many
flagellants.
Yeah, or Christian stockbrokers who decide to sell everything they have and live in a cave. You don't see that. They fixate on other areas. And I think that's always happening throughout history, and that's that question of, well, we kind of choose what we think is pure, and we want to hold on to that in some sense. I don't want to say totally, but in some sense that can be kind of arbitrary. I don't want to say completely, but there's something, could be something arbitrary about that.
Right. So we've talked a lot about how different interpretations of history can bring us to different conclusions and things like this. What is the utility of history? How can history be utilized, do you think, for today's purposes?
Yeah.
To understand how humans function, how humans behave in certain scenarios. I'm talking about a more general sense than interpersonal or personal. In general, how human behavior is. Do you think we can understand something like this from history?
Yeah, and I'll be more personal maybe, but so but I want to say again, it's very complicated, and you have to be careful not to use historical lessons in a cheap way, in my view. And there's a lot of that. You sit in a pub and talk about politics, and everybody immediately uses history for examples. Everybody knows everything about history, and so in fact, if you investigate a lot of those examples, you can learn a lot. But it's a long, hard road, and you can distill something out of that, but you can't be cheap about it. One thing that I'm drawn to, and I do this in my European history classes, some of you've done this, the project on the Holocaust that I usually do, because so much research is about the Holocaust and, well, the big question of how do you, and if you're psychology majors, you're probably interested in this too, how do you convince a sort of average person to become a horrific killer? How do you do that? You know, that's a really complicated discussion too, and that's not my point to really go into that, but so I've kind of worked out this thing in my European history classes where we ask another question that I think is equally legitimate. So there's about, the number is debated, maybe about 19 to 20,000 people in Europe, in the occupied countries, that instead of becoming killers, they did the opposite, and they tried to rescue Jewish neighbors. They hid them, they fed them, they made false passports for them. Some of those people just really risked their lives to do that. So I generally have my students do a project on that, because there is a sort of personal core reason for that, and it goes to exactly what can you learn from history. Well, when I look at that period, and it's a horrible period, it's not a good example of anything because it's so extreme, but and I ask myself though, if I lived then, you know, which kind of person would I want to be? Would I want to be the person that participated in the Holocaust? No. Would I want to be the person that just sort of stood by and didn't help? No, I don't want to. You know, I would want to be the kind of person that rescued and saved life. And that's a personal choice. And by the way, I don't mean that like I'm a saint, because I don't know that I would, because it was scary as hell. I mean, I don't know that I'd be that brave. I'm just saying, like, what kind of person would I want to be? Okay, so a lot of historians ask the question, how do you transform people into murderers? And that's a practical question, but here's another practical question about history, like what makes a person a brave rescuer in occupied Europe? What sort of personality characteristics, what kind of beliefs makes a person? And that's a practical question that if I could learn something from that, I can learn something for me. And ultimately, yes, that could be good for humanity. Now, that's not an easy question. It's not easy. It's not like, oh, you know, they grew up learning to love people that are different from them. It could be, but you know, it's not. What I'm saying is there's not a cliche answer to what makes a person a brave rescuer in occupied Europe. There's a bunch of possibilities, but so that's what I'm saying. If you do the hard work and you really examine that question, and it might take a while and it might be hard, but you could really get something powerful, right? You could learn what is it that makes that person, and you could learn something from that, so that if you're ever faced with that situation yourself, you might just be brave enough to act on what you learned. And that's how I would say history can benefit humanity.
Right. So is history a study of humanity, of
Yeah,
human
sure.
nature?
In some way,
Yeah,
yeah.
definition.
Yeah, I would say that's how I...
No, but I mean of humans as a human, as a man, as in it applies to us in that the lessons we learn are what make humans, how do humans act in different circumstances.
Yes, I feel that way. It's study of humans and how they behave in different circumstances and what you can learn from that. The only thing that I would keep saying is, as a historian, I know how hard it is to learn those lessons. They're not easy. It's not just about going to memorials and having a 5-minute emotional experience. They're complicated. Human motivations are complicated and contradictory and difficult, and that's what it comes down to. And learning those lessons, it's not easy, and that's the only warning I would give to people. You can learn lessons from history. I'm afraid most people don't. And part of the reason they don't is because they're satisfied with quick conclusions. And when you do that, then you don't really go to the heart of the matter, and you don't really figure out what's going on, and you don't really test yourself. But if you're willing to do that, then yes, there are lessons you can learn from history, but they're not easy ones.
An example for this, I think, is I don't know, I think you mentioned this in class, victimization, and how this is more or less a definitely bad thing that we shouldn't engage in. Eventually this leads to alienation of that group of people, and you know, the minoritarianism, and basically how these people sort of suffer from this entire scenario of victimization.
Well, yeah, I do talk about that in my classes in a couple contexts. You know, the Rwanda massacre in 1994. I think it's I usually give this question and answer dialogue by Gerard Prunier, and that's one thing that he says. You know, the Hutu, the Belgian colonizers patronized the Tutsi and gave them the higher positions in the government and educated them. And then after the Belgians left in the early 1960s, when Rwanda and Burundi become independent, the Hutus basically get control of the state. It's a Hutu nationalist party, so they have the power, but they continue to nurture this idea that the Hutu deserve, they were the elite, and they punished us, and they're dangerous, and we hate them for what they did to us. We still hate them. They thought they were superior, and they, like a lot of people seem to do in these situations, they kind of came up with this theory that the Tutsi are, it's the Hutu, they hate the Tutsi, sorry. The Tutsi are foreigners, you know, they come from further north, from Ethiopia, and they don't really belong in Rwanda. And so they nurtured, and I think there's a lot of things that go into that genocide, but they nurtured this idea that the Tutsi oppressed us, and they're somehow attached to colonialism, and because of that we hate them, and now we have control of the state, and it's our right, and there's not really a place for them in Rwanda anymore. It's a Hutu state.
Well, the appellation is cockroach.
Yeah, they call, yeah, absolutely, and it gets that bad when they call them cockroaches, and then eventually, yeah, it breaks out into that genocide in 1994, and about 800,000 people are killed. But I think you asked me about the victimization, and I think I didn't quote, but I cited Gerard Prunier, who talks about that. He says, you know, part of the motivation for this is that they feel that they're the victims, and that gives them this righteous indignation and allows them to do whatever they want. And that's when it becomes a genocide, and I think there's some connection there. And I think you can see that in other places too. And I think I always think that's a dangerous form of politics, to play that game of, and it works for politicians, I think, in a lot of different countries, where I can tell you, you know, you're a victim, and because of that, you should get revenge. And there's a certain part of the population, probably a lot of it, that likes that story. And then it kind of, I think it can justify whatever they want to do then at some point.
It's time to pay up.
Yeah.
Or time's up, or a certain mentality.
Yeah, and it's righteous. You know, that's how they feel about it. It's God's judgment in a way, even without God perhaps. But I am getting a little bit out of my discipline of history, but I think it's important to think about.
We've slowly come to the end of our podcast. If there's anything else that you guys want to add. All right. So thank you, Mr. Brandon, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed every minute.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.